of Cyber Power of Tigray. Welcome again. My name is Helena Tadesse. I have the honor of sitting here once again for part 2 of our conversation. Father Aaron Warwick. Good afternoon, Father.
Good afternoon, Helena. It's good to be back.
It's so good to have you back and to have had this to look forward to. I enjoyed our first conversation so very much and received such great feedback from our community. Thank you. Definitely. Our collective thank yous to our community who is reaching out and asking the questions and letting us know with the feedback. Yeah. Father, I think let's start with a recap of what our first conversation was about. As everyone knows, today is the anniversary of a very horrific event that happened during the Tigray genocide. 1 year ago today, there was an unspeakable, horrific massacre of over 800 Tigrayans in Axum, and specifically in the church of Mariam, Tzion Mariam, or Mary, in English, it's Mary of Zion. It's difficult to even recount, but the community knows it very well. At the very initial stages of this genocide, the Ethiopian federal government just pretended like Eritrean troops were not anywhere in the vicinity of the region. The prime minister completely denied that he had co-conspirated with the Eritrean government, which by all means is a foreign entity, a foreign government. And the outcries of the Tigrayan community was, they were gaslighting us pretty much. It was said to have been a reason, an excuse to bring international attention. What we have come to find out, not even a mere months later, was that in fact there had been a major massacre. 800 is a conservative number. There were eyewitnesses who, to this day, understandably are mentally scarred, emotionally stunted, but initially have recounted very, very much with detail what they saw. So we won't glaze over the fact that this is the 1 year mark of that massacre and that atrocities. And so we are here today to focus on, I've just named this conversation, the intersection of, faith and spirituality, religion. I know some people differentiate between, but the intersection of faith and trauma, what does that intersection look like? How do we draw on the strength that we had before? And like I mentioned with our father earlier, we will have a quick conversation, or however long it lasts, a conversation on our previous part 1 of this continuing conversation. Where shall we begin?
Well, I think the sort of recap what we talked about before, Helena, and what I encourage people to do in these situations of trauma is to ask the question, not why, but what can I do? Because these things don't make sense. It just like what you talked about, and it's one thing, there's people that are in armies, there are people that are soldiers, and it's bad enough when things happen to them. But in this case, what you're talking about, civilians, innocent people, people who didn't want to be part of this conflict, but just because of their circumstances, life circumstances, they're in harm's way. It's difficult to make sense of it. And if that's what we focus on, then why does it's paralyzing? But it's enabling when we think about what we can do, things that we can do. And some of the things we talked about, bigger picture things. We talked about lobbying. We talked about speaking with people in your community, your politicians, and so forth. We talked about sending money for causes, but ultimately, one of the things that we really talked about, and one thing I'd want us to focus on, and it's a good time of year for us as we are in this holiday season, this Christmas season for us Christians, is to focus on taking care of those who are needy in our own communities, and loving those who might not always be lovable, but we Christians are called to do that. And these types of things that we're talking about here, these massacres, they don't happen overnight. And what I mean by that is that the hatred in someone's heart, or the desensitization that they have that leads up to doing things like this massacre. People don't just wake up one morning and decide to do something like that. It starts small. It starts with viewing other people as other and not part of us, different communities. We talked about sitting down at the table of fellowship with one another, even in our households, over a meal, not just in church, and getting to know people and talking to them and figuring out. We find out a lot of times we have more things in common than we realize, even when we're on different sides of an issue. When you actually sit down and talk about these things, and that, doing those things is what stops that hatred from building. It's very difficult to sit at table with someone, to get to know someone and still view them as other, to still view them as an enemy. And so those are some of the things I think we highlighted the last time, and I want to reiterate again today.
That's great, and exactly right. I also remember a big takeaway from our conversation last week, 2 weeks ago.
2, I think so, yeah.
2 weeks ago, that's right. We talked about this idea of the perpetrators, in our case, in the case of the Tigrayan community, wearing this, our very sacred cross, as they perpetrated these, mass atrocities. They're taking pictures for keepsakes over mutilated bodies, in that sense. And we talked about how that is also, a mental warfare, a spiritual warfare, as well as an ethnic cleansing or ethnic-based warfare.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we talked about and tried to highlight is the fact that we can, that we reclaim the cross only and use it correctly by following in Jesus' footsteps. And we talked about how the cross was ultimately, Jesus was crucified because he refused to take up arms. He healed, Peter cut off the ear of one of the soldiers that was arresting him, and Jesus healed the ear. He put it back. He said, "No, Peter, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword." And so when people, misuse things like the cross, and that's happened, many, many times, unfortunately, historically, but when people do that, those of us who want to follow the true teaching have to reclaim it by continuing to live out the true teaching and not descending to the level of others, even as tempting as it may be, in the just how we tend to think biologically. Someone hurts us, someone kills some of our people, the tendency is to strike back, but that's never the answer. And as Jesus said, he who lives by the sword, again, dies by the sword. And so we have to take a different route. We can reclaim that cross and show the world what it truly means to take up the cross and follow him. So
that actually is twofold, isn't it? It is showing the world, or being a testimony of who our faith says we are, who we say we are in following this faith. And also, it is also reclaiming our sanity, or reclaiming that which is ours by the grace of God, and saying, you are trying to take away my family, my land, my people, but also you will not take away my beliefs and my God. It feels like that to me. Is
Yeah,
that
and it absolutely, and that's one thing I always try to counsel people in traumatic situations is maintaining that peace, maintaining your way of life, our way of nonviolence, and understanding and being forgiving. Because unless we do those things, unless we're forgiving, unless we continue to live our lives the way that we know it should be lived, then ultimately we're letting our enemies defeat us. They control our narrative. They control our entire lives. They control the way we think. They control the way we act. And so we're letting them be in charge. And this is what frustrated the, religious and civil authorities with Jesus. It's what frustrated when the martyrs went to their deaths. Those who were killing them were always frustrated because they couldn't get the martyrs to break. They couldn't get them to descend down to their level. They couldn't get them to repay violence with violence. They couldn't get them to repay evil with evil. They couldn't get them to say bad things about them. Jesus dies, and what does he say? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Many of the martyrs, follow in his footsteps. They kept control of the narrative. They kept control of themselves. And ultimately, our view as Christians is that in the end, we have to stand before the judgment seat, and we have to give an account for how we lived our lives. And if we let other people control our lives, no matter how evil they are, we're letting them win.
indeed? It feels like God gives us free will. That's God's ultimate gift
Right.
to man, womankind, isn't it? The
Yeah.
idea of, I keep saying this petulant child, now that I have
Right.
a child, I kind of understand.
Yes.
I'm
Yes.
so humbled because I see myself in him through the
Right.
eyes of,
Yeah.
possibly through the eyes of
Yeah.
God. And that gift of free will, and this is a personal belief, but that gift of free will is what has us, or this world, testing us. I don't necessarily personally prescribe to God testing us as much as the world testing us, and God continuously showing up with that beautiful grace.
Right.
Um, and I'm still working
Mhm.
that thought out, but it's been a
Yeah.
lifelong sort of instinctual feeling that it's us. We test each other. This world, this flesh tests.
Mhm.
We test ourselves, and that free will. And so, and knowing that, and saying, they are testing me in this as well. They want me to break because
Mhm.
that is their aim, isn't it? As the
Right.
perpetrator, even if it's not an ethnic situation, to the very the most common situation of assailant and victim, it is about breaking the victim. And so, to keep in mind what you mentioned is that you're not just safeguarding your sanity, you're not just safeguarding your faith, but that ultimate belief that Father would never forsake us, which is
Right.
ultimately tested, right, because of these unspeakable crimes, and that our Father loves us, and that our Father is nurturing and kind and full of grace. All of these things that we've come to know, and I speak for my community, and
Mhm.
specifically Christian Orthodox.
Right.
Um, it's such a test. It's such a test. What will you end up being at the end of this?
Right.
Will they have broken every part of us, or will we have fought for our spirituality, our soul, the way we've been fighting for our people?
Yeah, and going back to what you said about free will, I mean, I think that's an important point. But the other thing I want to highlight about that, because a lot of times this is connected, the way that we think about the human being is, of course, connected to Scripture in the very beginning in the book of Genesis, where we're told that we're created in God's image, and a lot of people, there's a lot of discussion and theology and so forth about what that means, and a lot of it is related to free will. But the thing that I want to highlight that I think a lot of people overlook is, historically in biblical times, there was an image, a physical image, an idol. It's the same word in the Hebrew and the Greek. There was an idol. There was an image of the emperor or the ruler of the city, the king of the city, and every place where there was a king, where there was a ruler like that, the worship of that idol was tied up in worship with the emperor, worship with the king. So the fact that God makes us is said to make us in his image. and us collectively, male and female humanity. The significance of that then is that we are supposed to present him, just as the emperor or the king in the ancient world was considered the only one who could truly present the image of God. We collectively, as human beings, can present that image of God to the world. So, what I'm getting at here is that, again, the way that we live our lives, the way that we choose to respond, whether we follow Jesus' teaching, if we do those things the way that Jesus taught us to do, we're showing the world God. We're representing him. We are his image. And it's important for us to never lose sight of that, because that's our job as human beings, is to present God to the world, even those, especially those, we should say, who are doing evil and who have turned against us.
Amen. That really resonates with my being, and immediately brings to mind advocacy. Amidst advocacy, especially online, where everybody has a say, everybody has a platform,
Right.
and you're there for one pure purpose of making sure these world leaders, making sure humanity in general does not forget that the Tigray genocide continues to be at the height of discussion and
Right.
policy making and things of that nature. You're combated by what they call trolls, of course,
Sure.
and very apropos. That's because that's literally it
Right.
feels like that's what they are, just like gremlins waiting at the at the bottom of the stairs just to and you're so taken. I feel so taken aback most of the time that you could someone would take this moment in their day to stop aid from coming to for humanitarian aid, for coming to people who are experiencing famine. You would stop a child from potentially losing a limb, especially for those people who are not online talking about politics a lot, or even at all, because we have a lot of our elders who really maintain, and also our health professionals who are always and very consistent about advocating for health reasons and humanitarian aid, like I mentioned, life-saving medications and things, mental health that is being completely devastated in Tigray because of the genocide right now. When you have these genocide apologists continuously show up just to nudge you, that showing up and representing who you are as a spiritual person. When you just said that, it brought me to that, because you wrestle with yourself at that moment, and it's a true test. I mean,
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
it's a true test. Father, research suggests that for many trauma survivors, spirituality may be a source that can be associated with resilience and recovery.
Right.
However, for some, the circumstance of trauma may lead to questioning of important and previously sustaining beliefs, especially in faith. Knowing that this is who God is in your life, constant and always with grace, and now you are in a feeling of abyss and unable to navigate. And we know, and we mentioned last week, that this trauma, this sort of occurrence, can lead to spiritual struggle or even loss of faith. Could you remind us what we said in terms of losing faith? I mean, the big takeaway from me, I can admit, is knowing that to expect that this is a possibility, to going through these types of crises during this time, and that maybe you'll back me up on this, but I feel like it's okay, that God is bigger than, and you mentioned the prodigal son, so I'll let you recap, but I'm excited to.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, should be expected. I mean, look, when things like when any sort of trauma happens, there are some good things that come along with that if we allow it, if we allow them to be good in the sense, like you've been saying about being tested. We're tested in school so that we can find out what we've learned and what we need to learn better. That's the purpose of a test that a teacher gives you. So when we're given these tests in life, it can turn into a good thing. And even when we may think that it's not, or when we start to question, because the reality is that no matter how strong we think our faith is, it's easy to say that when times are easy, when things are going well for us. It's more difficult when things are not going well, when we do start asking, why would God allow something like this, and so forth. And so, yeah, I think it's a normal process and a healthy process. We wish that it wouldn't have to be any sort of trauma like this, but just when things that naturally, we all have problems in life, and when we run into those, that's when I think we can use them as opportunities to grow. And yes, as you said, I mean, God's big enough to handle us. We shouldn't think that we're the center of the universe. That's sort of part of the problem, I think, that, and then why why it is that we don't question God when things are good, because we don't look around and see all sorts of other people are having other problems. Why didn't we question it then? We're very self-centered. So it can be an opportunity for us to learn we're not the center of the universe. And then, of course, like you mentioned, and I think we talked about the last time with the prodigal son, it's natural for people for a lot of people, not everybody, but it's natural for a lot of people to stray a little bit. It's natural in these times for people maybe to have to take a step back. I mean, there's this saying that we have in English that you take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I mean, sometimes that happens. And I think, though, for us as Christians, and you had talked about this before, about God's mercy, his compassion, his grace, and that's what we put our hope in. My hope isn't in, my ultimate hope is not to say that I don't advocate for things, that I don't get involved in certain areas of the political realm when I think it's necessary. I'm not big into politics, and clergy usually aren't supposed to be, but there are times when we advocate, especially in these humanitarian type of situations. But my hope isn't in politicians, because ultimately human beings are human beings, and when they get power, they tend to get corrupted, as the saying goes. And so our hope is in something greater than that. It's in that there is a judge beyond just this world. And when we have that hope, that's what can help sustain us and keep us moving on, and keep us realizing like this, that, the leaders of this world, not the be all end all. Right. So that for me is a key thing that I think about when I run into these tough times.
Absolutely right. It even makes me emotional to think how easily something like this could have been avoided if people to people conversations were being had, if we were engaging one another about the missings, so that these it seems very complicated from the outside, but it all comes down to, of course, like everything, ego and hurt feelings and not communicating.
Yes.
And in the spirit of that, and to share, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, but how I dealt with I shared last time we had this conversation. I'm a person who's used to having I'm going to say dialogue. I have dialogue. Mm-hmm. I speak with God, and then I listen in the winds or in the animals, in whatever it is that God speaks back in at that time on a daily, I'm going to go on a limb and say every second of the day, I'm aware that God, and maybe that's slight hyperbole, but it feels like it because I feel so in unison. And even when I'm doing things that I know he's shaking his head at, or, proverbially. Right. But what got me through that moment because when this happened, it was such a shock. Number one, I thought, wow, there have been other communities who've gone through things like this, and how could I have not shown up? That was maybe number two. Number one was, what is happening right now? You know,
Sure.
it was hard to ask why me or why us, because that's an unfair question. Why not us at any time? But it just seemed it was so polarizing that I really didn't feel comfortable communing with my father the way that I grew up knowing how to, the way my parents taught me, or the way they taught me that led me to the relationship that I have with him or had before this. And
Right.
I have to admit, what really helped me was I I owned up to it. First of all, I said,
Right.
"There's something not right here. I'm unable to go to God the way I used to, or even just to laugh with him, or whatever our usual was." And then I kept saying to myself, "I know, God, you're bigger." To that really inner pit of my stomach feeling, that knowing. I just kept saying, God, I know you're bigger than this, and I know you'll wait for me. And truly he did. And
Yeah.
truly he did.
Well, and
um,
I think another thing, Helena, that it kind of made me think about something is that often, it's easy for us to blame other people for situations, and we can often do that, with God. I mean, we talked about free will
mhm,
earlier, and so other people. I mean, it's not ultimately God who's responsible for this; it's other people who choose to do these things. But getting back to us, what can we do? Well, if we're blaming God, then we're basically throwing up our own hands and saying, um, we're saying that we're not guilty of anything, that there's nothing more that we can do. If it's God, it's someone else is the problem. We have to realize we're part of this problem in humanity, and the sin that we have collectively
mhm.
as human beings, and we need to do something about it. So quit blaming God, and again, ask, what can I do? And what does our religion teach us? What does Scripture teach us? What can we do in this situation, rather than looking to blame God,
Right.
looking to blame anybody? What can I do?
Because we have the roadmap, don't we? We
Yeah,
we
we do.
have we've always had the roadmap,
Right.
but
And
we
we
get
want to be
flustered.
blameless. We don't
Yeah,
want to be part of the problem. So in
that's
order to
especially
not be
when
part of
you're
the problem,
being
we have to be part of the solution.
right, when you're being obviously victimized, and it is, I'm not going to say easier, but I will fall into the victim role, because
Yeah.
it's clearly I'm being victimized, or my
Right.
community is being victimized, but that gives away control, doesn't it? Whatever
It does.
control is,
Yeah.
but that, you
And
know,
I'm really big on that, actually. I mean, what you just said about, like, being a victim. Okay, so, like, there is obviously people can and are victimized all the time, and sometimes in small ways, sometimes in large ways. But
Mhm.
there's a difference between recognizing that you're a victim in a situation and then taking on a victim's identity. And when you take on this identity of being the victim, it's out of your control. It's out of your hands. Um, and then ultimately, then the victim, or excuse me, the perpetrator is the one who's telling the narrative, who's telling the story, who's,
Correct.
you're reacting, you're always responding to what the victim is doing. And so it doesn't mean that pretend that people aren't victimized, or pretend that you're not a victim, but you don't take that identity.
Right.
So there's a big difference between identifying yourself as, oh, I'm just a victim,
Hmm.
versus saying, okay, wait a second, I'm being victimized. I don't need to, like, passively accept that, but I also not going to take on this whole mantra that I'm a victim, 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 and therefore I'm not in control. We
Right.
take control of things, and again, that lets us be the one in charge of our own narrative and not someone else, and therefore we're free to follow the narrative that we have in Scripture, that God has given us and that the church has given us, for how we should live our lives.
Truly. Now, I have to say, never been more proud, and pride, but I've never been more proud to belong to a community, because there are people continuously doing the work to take back their, I don't want to use control, but to take back what is, what someone is trying to take away, whether
Right.
that's, it's everything. They try uh, to take you down to the very least level,
Yeah.
because that's what it takes to deconstruct a human being. As we're talking about, it's, your pride in your country or nation, your pride in your sexuality, because we know so many people are going through, and women, girls, and boys and men going through sexual-based violence, or I'm sorry, gender-based violence with sexual violence. And so, and your faith, trying to deconstruct your faith, as we've spoken about with the wearing of the cross. And I don't even think they know what they're trying to do, but it's a subconscious, it's just on every level in terms of taking pictures with the cross and things like that. I don't think they woke up and said, let me, mess with your spirituality too. But that's inevitably what ends up happening. But just, just to remind us that you're not always going to feel strong. It's a matter of taking back that control, taking, every day waking up and saying, I choose to be free, especially those of us who are privileged enough, are blessed enough right now to live in a free society where we can make as much noise as possible for our community, our families. I think also be kind to yourself, allow grace for yourself, because there's also guilt. I've noticed that comes with that when you wake up and it's really a hard day for you and you think, I shouldn't be feeling like this. I should be fighting even harder. They can't, they're muzzled right now, or you can't get out of bed. And then people who, and we talked about this slightly last week, people who may be prone to, mental health occurrences like, or have bouts of depression or, chemical imbalance, whatever people are dealing with that this trauma can trigger.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, to give ourselves this grace, because it feels like it's an everyday process where you wake up and say, today I choose to take back control. And some days it's just going to be harder than others, and I think some days you're not even gonna make it. But that promise of tomorrow, right? That promise that someone a long time ago put me onto this song called "What a Difference a Day Makes." 24 hours, but holding on for that, and then hopefully clinging on to the one thing we know that will never let us down, which is God. That I just keep coming back to that. That is our constant, and He's our constant if we allow Him to be. This gives me a little just a nice little bridge to talk about the fact that talking about having conversations, being or just engaging conversations about how our spirituality has been affected by this trauma, by these atrocities, also opens up space for us to commune, because a lot of times we are wanting to isolate ourselves. I'm seeing this in parts of my family members, my immediate family members, where it gets so burdensome, and you call and you get a text, I'll call you back, sorry. There's no call back later. You write or you ask the neighbor, your cousins or whomever, and slowly this person or these persons are going into a shell. And so the idea that even having these conversations about how you may be coping, spiritually through this trauma can be a way of communion with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, for whatever reason, it's when we humans we see the best and the worst come out of us. And so in these situations, you really do see people that are strong in their faith, that maybe are strong in terms of their mental health and so forth, are able to help out those who aren't as strong. And then there's times when, maybe we're strong at one time or in one situation, we need help in the next.
Right.
So yeah, it's a
wonderful, patience.
Yes, wonderful opportunity for us to
Right.
serve one another in that way, and like you said, to commune and come together.
Yeah, I feel very called to, whether you want to see my face or not, I feel very called to show up and as much as I can and let you know it's okay not to be okay. But I'm not so great with the patience online with people who put our community down. And so we really work hand in hand. I belong to a wonderful organization called HPN for Tigray, amazing, amazing NGO that, I mean, like I've mentioned this on social media this week, life-saving medications, also opened up a community center, mental health facility in Sudan, where, and Dr. Samhal also, and
Yes.
how we connected, just a wonderful psychiatrist who is like my big sister now. So I think about those people there, and that, and how I've been by grace shaped to be a little bit more patient, because this is also new to me. You know, our my older sisters and brothers in the community have known about this rhetoric, this dehumanization of our community, which is a minority group. We are 6% of 110, 115 million people. And in my household, like many households of Tigrayans, we were told that it's just one Ethiopia, you know, it's one Ethiopia. Don't get into politics. But what I didn't know was how active my mother and father were behind the scenes, you know, just really engrossed in the news, and really always giving back to our community. But they felt like that was a service that they were doing for us, keeping us out of the politics. And I think it's truly because deep down, our parents have this hope for that one Ethiopia. But unfortunately, what we found out was something totally different. So myself and those like me who are very, you know, aghast at what's going on, tend to get a little short online. And from what we're talking about today, you know, showing up with the grace, showing up with how I know God would want me to show up, and also trading off, you know, I'll show up on camera with all its negative, like you know, I'll just show up and do what I can, and I know God will take the rest, take the reins, you know, and deliver it how it needs to be delivered. And some people may not feel comfortable with that, but my faults are, you know, thankfully they elevate me, and they, you know, we do this balancing act. So I think that's a great point. That's a
Yeah.
really good thing also to remember when we are having those really down moments where the I can't, or how can I, how will I, is that you're not alone. I mean, our community is more together, is closer than we've ever been. So not only, you know, is the grace of God, you know, watching over us and saying, I'm here when you're ready. I believe it's also, like you said, bringing about people around that can balance out that
Right.
you know, those attributes
Yeah.
as we move along. No, Father Aaron, I did send you that article because I wanted you to about. Uh, it was in February that the news actually started to get out about Mariam Zion of
Right.
Axum, the 800 plus, and even then they didn't have a right count on it. And then when there was a semi-legitimate, I will say, you're not saying it, but I will say a semi-legitimate investigation, an investigation that wanted to look at legitimate. The numbers weren't even right. It was 100. They did some crazy approximation. Yes, we know that anywhere from 100 to 800 people were massacred. I mean, is that 100? Is that 101? Is that 800? You know,
Mhm.
so and then and then false narratives that have come from that. But really talking about that article that I sent you, for AP article, I'm just curious as you learn more and more of the specifics, because I know you are, you know, of our community, and just completely, I mean, dedicated your time and promised more time to our well-being, the community at large. I wonder, what was your first take when you read that article?
Um, sad, uh, very sad, and unfortunately, not that surprising, because you kind of referenced this earlier. Like, you know, you said, why wasn't I aware of, or why didn't I make myself aware of these things happening to other people? And unfortunately, as someone who's, tried to study history and tries to um, keep up with some of the humanitarian things that go on across the world, it, I mean, it's tragic, but it's like you become numb to it, in the sense, not that it doesn't make you sad, but it's just like, we human beings, I mean, we are made in the image of God, and that we can do such amazing things and good things, but we can also go so wrong. And this is just one of those situations where, it's so sad to see human beings uh, descend to that level. And whether it was 100 or 800, whether it was one, you know, there's no need for that. There's no need that it doesn't, we have other ways, as being created in God's image, as having free will, as having rationality. We have ways to work out our differences and to resolve things, without turning to violence. And yet we so often do this. And again, my focus is I definitely advocating for, things like you're doing, or for Palestinians, or for, anyone who's in a minority group that's, being persecuted. But also then to look back, as I've been saying, like, what do I do that, how could I live my life better with people that are in my neighborhood? Like, because again, this type of behavior, as we mentioned at the beginning, it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, it's not like people wake up, very rarely, that. So it starts, it starts much smaller. And if we can't learn to love our neighbor, how are we going to love a stranger? So it was extremely sad. Not surprising, again, because I've seen how we humans can descend to this level. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's wonderful to have an opportunity to come on a show like this, to talk about things openly, and talk about how we can be part of the solution in the bigger picture.
Definitely. Thank you for that. I wonder if you were able to speak with someone who's faced these, just like we keep calling them atrocities, but these heinous crimes, these violations. And I know from past experience, from friends, that there is this sense some people who are victimized get of, and we've read this in the newspapers, where a woman may say, "What did I do to them?"
Right.
A woman who's violated, or a community member who's seen her loved ones killed in front of her eyes. Specifically, this one woman comes to mind, and she said, "What did we do?" As a spiritual leader, how would you talk to someone? What would you say to this person who feels, "What did I do either to them, to God? Where did I go wrong?" What would you say to this person?
Well, I always try to be open and honest with people. And the answer to that question can be, unless I have more details that they did something. In this case, I know they didn't, but nothing. You didn't do anything to them. And again, we work through these things that we've been talking about on this show and on the previous one, about how to work through that, and but the real problem, I think, because what I really help people try to avoid is, for whatever reason, I don't know why we humans do this. I've done it myself, and I've had to, go speak with people that I trust, and I've even gone to counselors before to just have a few sessions to talk through things. But when someone victimizes us, no matter how big or how small, our tendency, at least if we're healthy human beings, spiritually and mentally healthy human beings, our tendency is to find a reason to blame ourselves. And it's almost like that's what people are looking for when they ask that question: what did I do to do? And what ends up happening is they end up start thinking about, well, we all make mistakes in our lives, right? We all have sinned, and we've all done things we wish we could take back. And so then they start, unfortunately, blaming themselves for, well, I did this when I was younger. I did this a few years ago. And no, that's not why. That's not why. I mean, and to try to help people understand that if we truly understand the scriptural message, we need to get out of this mindset that there's this God in the, in the heavens that's just watching every move and waiting to punish us because we made some mistakes. No, not at all. This is not the God that we serve. This is not the God of the universe. And so that's, one of the things that I try to focus on with them is to understand you did nothing. I mean, and maybe that sounds like a dissatisfactory answer to a lot of people, but it's the truth. And if we don't recognize that as the truth, then I do think that our tendency is to try to find something to blame ourselves. Or, like you said, to blame God, but neither of those are helpful. The most helpful thing in my experience is to help people understand, hey, look, people do bad things all the time. And I use the example. I mean, look at, because another thing is a lot of people think they have this mistaken notion that, if I'm a good person, if I try to live according to God's will, I try to represent him, then good things will happen in my life. And then there's this extreme, we hear it about it all the time in America. If you turn on religious shows in America that preach what's called the prosperity gospel, which is basically saying, if you live a holy life, good things will happen to you. I said, well, how does that? Doesn't make sense to me. I read the story of Jesus. He was the most holy person that ever lived. Yeah. It didn't work out so well here on this earth, for him. His judgment was reversed in the end. Right. But, so we have to understand that bad things happen to good people all the time. And it's not God punishing us for anything. It's because there are people in the world that go astray. There are evil things that happen. And it's okay. It's healthy to recognize that. And it's also freeing, I think, to recognize that. And then again, to go back to that question, what can I do now? Given that this has happened. And some of the most powerful people in the world in terms of positive changes that influence people are people that had been victimized and they didn't take that. They were able to get beyond that victim identity, and they used what happened to them because they said, what can I do? They used what happened to them to make positive changes in the world, to make other people's lives better, to help others who have been through those types of situations. So, ultimately, when these bad things happen, as terrible and tragic as they are, if people are able to get through them in a healthy manner, they can become some of the most powerful voices and agents of change.
Because nobody knows, the trauma inside and out like somebody who's gone through it. So I completely agree. That'll be my little one. Yeah. There used to be a time where I would cringe, but these days I really welcome the little cries and the, it's what brings me back to the present moment, because what's happening to our brothers and sisters are so breathtakingly saddening. What I want to do is just to quickly, actually, let me just to recap that, because you said some really profound things. And my prayer is that somehow someone who's dealt with this firsthand hears more people saying what you said, which is, to me, translates as, it's not your fault. And from, representative of the church, I think, especially in our community, that means so much. There's weight in that. So it's not your fault, and it's not God doing something to you, and it's not God forsaking you, and it's not God allowing things and the evil that men do, so to speak. God is in the grace and not the evil. Free will, for better or worse, is what causes the ill will, unfortunately. But like a wonderful father, he's there to catch us and provide grace. And I believe these nonprofits that have sprung up from our community, these people who have taken up whatever their arms look like, advocacy or mental health, whatever people are comfortable in supporting in. I think that's part of God's grace, right? Don't you agree? That's where God continues to show up for our people, showing them not only people of their own community, but also allies like yourself, like those, I think about Professor Diaz, in our advocacy group, the AmeriCorps people. I mean, so many people just show up, Brother Dennis Wadley. I mean, too many to mention, even though there's a good, just a handful, but still you're overwhelmed because you feel seen, because it's somebody outside of your community who's now joined your community. Bethany, just those who are extremely active on social media, and you're just arm in arm in advocacy, and that helps you feel not so alone.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yeah. So my prayer is that someone who's affected firsthand also hears this, along with our brothers and sisters who are, watching us from these United States and beyond. I'd love to answer a couple of questions or just recap for some people who may have joined us late. There's a lot of in the comments just thanking you, Father Aaron, as usual. Thank you both. Thank you, Father Aaron. Tigray Gal Adwa says thank you. We are strong enough. Be strong, my people, says Alpha, and support our brothers and sisters. They are alive, fighting for our freedom. That's true. I keep thinking the way we honor those who are sacrificing their lives on the front lines, and what a lot of people in the West and beyond don't understand is that there was no such thing as TDF before the situation. It's not like, it was just Tigrayan military or people of Tigray who were involved in the military, but TDF is full of people who've been who are military but also assaulted and traumatized. These are people taking up arms and saying, really, no more. They're the actual no more people, no more gang rapes, no more abuses, no more killings and massacres, and no more, for Tigray. And so you're right, Alpha. The way we honor them, I truly believe, is by as much as we can advocating and seeking policy, and showing up in that way. And after this conversation with you, Father Aaron, also a way we honor them is by using our efforts for that, and not for silly conversations, tit for tat sort of attacks that they pull us into. So you've helped me. I want you to know I wasn't out there being a tyrant, but I truly would sit there for a good 5 minutes that I could have been tweeting extra tweets, or who knows, making phone calls or whatever it may be, or even taking a walk so that I can continue my tweets, or writing or editing for policy. And I would sit there and compose a retort and edit it, and then think about why I shouldn't send it, and then think about God watching me do this, and then think about all the things I mean, that's a good 5 minutes, maybe sometimes I admit 10 minutes off of my life for worthless situations. So in that way, thank you, Alpha. That's a great addition there. Faith, Hope, Love says, thanks for your continued support and teachings. Thank you, Father. I do want to recap from Mike Lowry, who says, thank you for this. How do we deal with the weaponization of religion in this and other conflicts? It seems like the religious leaders, very good point, religious leaders lead the battle cry oftentimes. And Mike is right, not just in history, because, crusades and every other war that's been fought supposedly in the name of God and Christ, which is ludicrous. As you said, that's not the God we serve. So it's such a misnomer. But also in this particular genocide, they're so free and gallant about it, as they're being video recorded, saying things like, these devils are made for fire. Completely dehumanizing and not making even a distinction between the army or politics, just
And
in general, Tigrayans and demonizing. So, uh, Mike, Mike says, how do we deal with the weaponization of religion?
yeah, I mean, I think what we talked about is just we have to show the true teaching. We have to show them and show the world what the gospel really is by living it ourselves. There's really no other way to do it than that. And to, even as you're doing here, to just bring that to light, the fact that people do use this. And it shouldn't be surprising, because when we read scripture, we see it constantly. When are there all these major problems that start with Israel? Well, it starts with the kings. When all of a sudden the kings identify, um, with the religion, and they meld this religion, and the politics always wins out, and the power always wins out. We see with the religious community, who were the ones persecuting Jesus. It was the religious leaders of the Jews. It wasn't necessarily the common folk so much that were. It was the respectable religious leaders and the zealots, the ones who claimed to be, holy and trying to live out God's will. They were the ones that persecuted him. So it really shouldn't surprise us. And I think we just have to call it out for what it is.
You're right. You're right. It shouldn't surprise us. And if Christ could be sold for 30, whatever equivalent to a
Pieces.
dollar, it shouldn't surprise us that human beings are selling out human beings. You're right. What is greater story or example uh, of the complete betrayal of man than the story of Christ?
Yeah.
Absolutely right. I hope that helps. And I know an answer like something having to do with action is maybe a lot of times what we want to hear, rather than inaction, because literally we're saying
Right.
don't act and be an example by that.
Hmm.
But there's a reason why I dare say our being fights against that. It's because a lot of times we're just doers. We want to do. What do we do? What do I do? But
Yeah,
honestly,
but it
that's
takes a lot of action inside, that you can't see,
right.
to get yourself to that
Good.
position. So when you, like, just going back to a simple example, like an online troll that you talk about, waste, like, there's that part inside of us that wants to respond, wants to do tit for tat. And, it takes a lot of action inside of our minds, inside of our spirit, to muster up
Not
the strength
act.
to not act. Yeah. And to not descend to their level.
Yeah.
There's an old saying in English that, about, if you run with dogs, you get fleas, or, if you wrestle with pigs, you're gonna get muddy. And so, like, in the end, if we descend to that level, how are we really any different? People just see that we're muddy. So I think that's a good reminder for us to stay above the fray, uh, even in those times when it may appear that it's inaction. There's actually a lot of action going on within us that gets us to the point where we say, you know what, I'm not gonna descend to that level.
That's right. And I want to clarify for Gal Adwa. You mentioned in your notes here, our people are not going to just sit around until they come finish us. That's not what we're talking about, right? If,
Right.
if you're following, and I know you've been following along in the conversation, we're just talking about in the midst of advocacy, those people who are trying to sway our attention elsewhere instead of sitting there and going back and forth, because it does absolutely nothing to trade insults when we
Right.
could use that energy for what we need to do for our people. And of course, in terms of our people in Tigray, that's who we're honoring by advocating the way we are, because surely they're not sitting around. I don't know any, and this is not to take anything away from any other community that has dealt with genocide. I have to mention, I don't know personally in history any other people that have dealt with genocide and have turned it around and now are the offensive. And this is not our people sitting around, Gal Adwa. And I agree with you, but I want to make sure you're following the conversation. We're not saying let's take it laying down. We're saying let's continue to make progress the way we are by continuing advocacy and not getting caught up in their political mess that they are trying to pull us down with. everything in advocacy that we have done thus far for a year and some change, what they'll do is they will take over, take over the designs, take over the hashtags, take over the platforms, take over. But that speaks to how successful we have been in shedding light and bringing the world's attention to what we're doing. And we have to believe that the truth is what prevails. And that's why we continue to say Tigray will prevail, because we're the ones saying, hey, look over here, investigate here, look into this. We're not out there planning stories, or like this crazy story that came out today. This genocide apologist, UK citizen, was seen speaking to thousands of people in the hopes of recruitment, because what's happening is US nationalists and abroad foreign nationalists will go back to Ethiopia. They will enjoy an audience of thousands of people, poor people, not the elites, but the poor people, and they will say, I will be joining the front lines. And this is who we are. And we're fighting like the emperors, our forefathers. And this news came out that he actually was on death row, and lobbyists came and pleaded for his life. And now he's gone back to Ethiopia to bring addition recruitments to this genocidal war. So when you see things like that, of course you're going to be livid, but we can't take our foot off the gas, because what's working is what's working. And let's just continue on. And what Father is saying is, it takes a lot of action to not act. And that's in terms of, don't get caught up in the mess. Let's just keep our people in mind. Let's keep pushing the truth, because again, our community's job is to point a big arrow to all the evidence. I mean, that's all we do is, all the tweets, but what other people do is fabricate. It takes so much time and effort to fabricate. I truly believe the truth is the easiest, most convenient. Do you know what I mean? It's just, right. It's just the truth. It's just what is. So let's just continue that. So I kind of went away with myself, but I do notice conversations like this in the community. So I wanted to make sure we addressed it. So I'll just pick out a couple more. It's dangerous for. Do you think it's dangerous for impartial Amharas, the other ethnic group, who are not hypnotized by the war doctrine? Do you think it is dangerous for them? How do we protect them? Wayana means rebellion. We are fanning the flame inadvertently. So, Mike, I think I understand, especially the first part of your question, Father, if you don't mind. I will say this. They know how to protect themselves, and I think if we need to protect them, that looks like not implicating them by expecting them to say something, because there are those, inevitably there are going to be those people. We're not seeing a lot of them, but maybe because they're trying to stay safe. So I say let's carry the torch that we need to carry, and let them find the different ways that they can be allies, and let's protect them by not expecting them to be out here saying things and doing things, right? Because if you're asking this question, you care about them, or you have family members who are ethnic Amharas and possibly may not be part of the genocidal regime, which is possible. We shouldn't clump everybody with the majority that we see. So that would be my response to that. Okay, last question. Could this ever happen in the US? Father?
Sorry, I was on mute. My kids were.
Oh, it's okay.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely, it can happen anywhere. I mean, we don't know, we can't predict the future, but I mean, what I would say about the US is we have our own, and this is important for us to know and advocate about these types of things too. We know what has happened in the past, like, the FBI, the CIA, for example, being involved in things, not just overseas. There's been a bunch of that. There still is, including in Ethiopia. But there's also things that have happened here where, they've tested things on minorities,
Right.
Yeah, to see if a drug worked, different
Tuskegee. Right.
mind control stuff, and things of
Right.
this nature. Tuskegee. If you read things like if you look it up, just on a search engine or something, I think it was the Church Committee. That was a
Mm.
committee of Congress several decades ago that investigated, and it's public information now what they found. Now there were things that were destroyed. There was evidence destroyed of presumably things that happened that were worse than than the evidence that remained. Um, but if you look at some of those things that happened, things like this have happened to an extent in the U.S. Maybe a slightly different in terms of the identities involved, but these things happen anywhere, and that's why again I'm an advocate of learning to love your enemy, talking to people that with whom you disagree. In this country now in the U.S., there's so much politicization that people, I mean, a lot of families have broken up or don't talk to each other anymore, and it's sad. I mean, they're because they're in the end when you sit down and talk about there's a lot of the same concerns. Maybe you have different ideas about what the solution should be, but we at least have some common ground on some of the concerns and things of that nature. So yeah, in short, it could happen here. I mean, and for all the things that a lot of things have come out, for example, on when J. Edgar Hoover was in charge of the FBI, some of the things that they did, I can't think of the organization's name, the Black Panthers, I think it was in Chicago. Some of the things they did, there's a recent movie about that, and they the FBI's building is named after J. Edgar Hoover. So
Right.
what does that? I mean, what does that tell you?
Sure.
Like the fact that we still consider that J. Edgar Hoover to be a respectable enough person to have his name on the FBI building. I mean,
Right.
who's to say what could happen in the U.S.?
Right. Right. There's nothing is off. It's not out of the realm of possibility. But I think um, not. But and uh, I think because we enjoy this free society, the ability to scream at it just out loud and to galvanize quickly, and for those people who continue to be at the forefront fighting for the true meaning of what it means to you know have autonomy and self-determinance, and to say there's something wrong in the American, whether it be constitution or whatever it may be, unlike some other countries where,
Yeah,
you know, yeah, where you're silenced immediately or killed in permanent silence. But yeah, I agree. Nothing is out of the realm of possibility, but God willing, we won't, have
yeah,
to face
hopefully.
that here. Thank you guys so much for the questions. Christians are weak to become voice of our breath. No, we're strengthened by God's voice to be the voice of our brothers and sisters. There's a question about Orthodox Christians. Are we too weak to become voice of our brothers and sisters that belong to other Orthodox churches that are dying in Syria, Tigray, and other parts of the world? And you might have come a little bit later on in the conversation, SMC, but I invite you to please click rewind and check out the full conversation. I'm so glad you joined. So glad everybody who's joined live. And I have a favor to ask of you. Won't you share this conversation? Right now, you're watching it on Facebook or YouTube, which is where we're streaming from. And just for the sake of starting this type of dialogue or continuing this dialogue, just for the sake of our community members, it's not really taking a break from advocacy, because this too is part of advocacy. Wellness of mind equals wellness of spirit, and vice versa, and of body, and it's all informing the other. So please share it on your Facebook. For more questions that you'd like to submit, I've put my email, which is helenanow@gmail.com. That's Doggy saying it's time to go, for Father Aaron's awesome podcast that I'm glued to while I was doing research. It's a really good one. It's a really good one. It is Teach Me Thy Statutes. And You can find it wherever podcasts are available. Simple Google search, and you have a newfound wealth. Before we leave, I want to remind you, I'm sure you've seen all of the tweets and the posts on all platforms. After Thanksgiving comes, of course, Black Friday. And then after Black Friday comes this really wonderful new sort of thing called Giving Tuesday, which is where you show how truly thankful you are for having been able to spend the money and having been able to partake in the food by giving. And especially if you do itemized taxes, then knowing that there are nonprofit organizations that you can list on your taxes will make you very delighted to contribute a lump sum, huge amounts, or whatever you can. And even if you don't, then you'll just be happy to know that it's going to great charities. I'm always here talking about HPN for Tigray, Health Professional Networks for Tigray, Network for Tigray, of which I am a member, also a board member. I have seen this from the baby organization to a full-blown 501(c) organization. And I talked about the community center, health center that's been opened in the refugee camps. But what you don't know about is it's the cliche sounding word, but it's real. The tireless amount of hours that go in. These are surgeons and pediatricians and nutritionists and ER doctors and lawyers and students and tech people. And Jane, who came from Adwa not too long before the situation, who was in AmeriCorps. And I mean, and it's Rashawn and it's Sella and it's, Christina and it's Helena. And there are also men. There's Dr. Jonas. Like, there's 241, 42 people who are just, just tugging away. And there's that core group who's just constantly and consistently going and communicating with, before the siege, we were able to do a good amount within Tigray. And then, of course, they encapsulated our people. And so now we're doing all that we can in the refugee camps. And at any point, you can ask about the mental health, how many asthmatics, how many people in a wheelchair, how many people, how many women gave birth, how many women, how many men are dealing with hypertension. And this is the group that will give you the numbers that continues to show up in these meetings with elected officials. This is a group that is just, taking care of people in the daytime while they're doing this work, while, like most of us, and you should know there's that added pressure. You're holding a life and you're trying to save a life elsewhere, and you don't even know if your parents are alive. You don't even know if your family's alive. So I really wanted to honor them, honor us. I do what I can, but they just do so much. I feel so humbled. So all this to say, we're also participating in Giving Tuesday. And yesterday was my birthday. I'm feeling very blessed to have this new community of family members, including you, Father Aaron, including everyone who's, tunes in and shares these for the sake of our people. So I've put out an all call, whatever you can. My philosophy in life about charity is a lot of us give a little bit and it becomes a lot. So a lot, give a little, it becomes a lot. And if you can give a lot, then give a lot, whatever it is to you, every bit counts. So this is where you can go. You can go straight to HPN for Tigray and donate, or you can go to Facebook /Helena Now. I'm just Helena Now on all platforms. And I've made it, I've made the I made it available to everyone. So my ask to you, because I know you give so much already, I know you give so much. So my reaching out on all social media platforms is to bring in our allies, to allow others to contribute. Our community does so much, and I'm so thankful. We are so thankful. So what I'm asking you, if you can contribute, great, but I'm not asking you for more. I'm asking you, as Dr. Rashawn says, let's go outside of our echo chamber. Let's go outside and allow others to give to us, to our community. So post it on your social media and say, if you've been listening to me talk about Tigray and you just didn't know how to help, this is the way you can help. So having said all of that, any closing remarks, Father Aaron? No pressure.
No, I mean, thank you for presenting these opportunities to everyone out there. This is, and to myself as well. I want to check this out. It's one of the best things that we can do to help people in that situation, besides the advocacy, is to do things that help actually get that humanitarian aid to them. Very difficult for people to take care of their spiritual needs, to think at any higher level when they don't have the basics. And I think that's something that we as Christians think everybody deserves, even our enemies, right? They deserve food and water and basic, access to keep their health and so forth. So, yeah, very, very good. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As always, I'm just wishing you all of God's blessings, that Look, I'm going into this. It feels like this should be your take on it. But I just feel compelled to just, remind us that that's what we're promised, is God's grace, just because we're his children. I mean, that's it. That's just it. So I pray that we give grace. And it's not the easiest, because we've got this thing called free will, which we've talked about today. So let's do our due diligence and know it doesn't have to be a battle, but if you have to battle yourself a little bit to rise to the occasion that God knows you to be, that God knows me to be, then let's take on that challenge. And we never leave without reminding ourselves and each other, Tigray tse'er, Tigray tse'er, Tigray shall prevail. The truth shall prevail. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Father Aaron.
Yeah, God bless you all. Thank you, Helena.
Thank you, Father. Do you know how much I appreciate you?
I don't know.
Do you? Legitimate question. Are you getting it? Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to just do everything I needed to do, and just being so cool and calm and collected. It was about 2 minutes before, and I said, Father, here's the link. And you're just present and there. And I so appreciate you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.